Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Mark Lacasse. I was born in 1961. I grew up and went to school in Massachusetts. Later attended university at Cornell and Purdue. And in years subsequent, lived most of my adult life overseas.
So what are some memorable experiences and connections that you recall from the Cold War?
Well, the Cold War is very much something that everyone in my generation grew up with and felt would be a part of us for the rest of our lives. Um, Even from the early days, I went to school very soon after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so that's one of the things that we thought about quite a bit. Later in college years, studying international relations over in Europe, in Switzerland specifically, I had some encounters there with student protest groups over the INF treaty negotiations. And later, as a businessman, I had quite some interactions with the Eastern Bloc countries working for a banana company.
Could you please elaborate on your early impressions of the Cold War?
Sure. Well, it really wasn't much. It was more in these early years we weren't, obviously thinking politically and in terms of geopolitics and whatnot. But there are these impressions that were very much a part of our school years. Our teachers would often tell us about how they had done these drills during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where children were had to hide under their desks at the sound of an alarm. Today perhaps that sounds a little bit ridiculous, but at the time that was very real to people, and it apparently marked the teachers' impressions, because although I didn't experience that, we would hear about it quite a bit through the early years. Later, as the Vietnam War grew, and we would hear a lot, even in our history classes, about the geopolitics of these proxy wars, Vietnam War being one, the Korean War being another, and whatnot, where the Soviet bloc and the Western NATO alliance would kind of face off in other countries around the world.
You also spoke about a time that you remember studying international relations abroad, in Switzerland specifically. Could you please elaborate more on that and how that experience shaped you?
Yeah, sure. This was a very interesting experience which not only shaped me and some of my own political views, but really got me right into the thick of some of the debate and events that were going on in the early 1980s. 1982 specifically, I was studying international relations during a study abroad program through Kent State University in Geneva, Switzerland. One of my classes, it was actually a class called Democracy, and the professor wanted us to gain real-world experiences with other forms of participatory democracy. That is to say, not just going out and voting, but other ways in which people make their views and wishes known in a free society. And interestingly, at that time, there were very large and significant peace movement and protest marches going on throughout Europe, especially in Geneva, Switzerland, where there were negotiations underway between the Warsaw Pact and the NATO alliance.
The Warsaw Pact involved a group of 8 Soviet states and was the military part of CONCON. Stalin created this pact in response to Western Germany joining NATO in 1955. NATO, or the North American Treaty Organization, was established by the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949 for purposes of collective security. NATO includes the United States, Canada, and many European nations. This clash between the Warsaw Pact and NATO increased Cold War tensions,
which eventually resulted in the INF Treaty, Intermediate Range Nuclear Weapons Treaty.
The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty, was a U.S.-Soviet agreement which sought to eliminate intermediate-range nuclear missiles.
These missiles had a range of 312 to 3,120 miles. The treaty was ultimately signed on December 8, 1987, and ratified by the U.S. Senate on May 27, 1988. Upon taking office, Ronald Reagan and his administration sought to restore U.S. superiority over the Soviet Union. The first formal INF proposal was submitted to the Soviet Union on December 1981. Reagan revealed the U.S.'s position in his zero-option speech, in which he would cancel missile deployments to the Soviet Union, and in return, they would eliminate all intermediate-range nuclear missiles. The zero option was Reagan's way of demonstrating the administration's desire to achieve greater reduction in armament. The years to come would bring many negotiations, each country trying to push their own interests. Many times, both governments would reject plans that were presented. Between 1981 and 1983, negotiations were strained by deteriorating U.S.-Soviet relations. From 1982 and 1985, the Soviet Union faced unstable times as there were three changes in leadership. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev assumed control and negotiations carried on until an agreement in which both the U.S. and Soviet would eliminate all deployed and non-deployed intermediate-range missiles, short-range missiles, their launchers, support facilities, and operating bases worldwide. Ultimately, they agreed to eliminate a total of 2,695 intermediate and short-range missiles.
At the time, the Western Alliance felt that in order to counter the intermediate range missiles which the Eastern Bloc countries had already deployed, that Western Europe also needed to deploy missiles in countries like Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, etc., in order to counteract that. The idea initially came from Chancellor Helmut Schmidt of Germany, and was very much championed by Reagan and Thatcher at the time.
Ronald Reagan was born on February 6, 1911, in Illinois. He was first governor of California from 1966 to 1974. He then became President of the United States in 1981. During his campaign, he relied on restoring American pride and self-confidence. His legacy is most often remembered by events such as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the liberation of Grenada, the stifling of Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, and the signing of the INF Treaty. Margaret Thatcher was the first female Prime Minister of Britain elected in 1979 when Conservatives won the majority of the seats in the election. She then served 3 consecutive terms as a Prime Minister. Thatcher sought to transform England from a second-rated European economy into a leading European economy and world power by dismantling Britain's socialist infrastructure. She also became an active figure in foreign affairs and developed a strong relationship with the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev.
A lot of the protest movement felt that this was an escalation on the part of Western Europe. They felt that we didn't need to do that. The Soviets, for their part, felt that any negotiation on intermediate range missiles should include the Western, the missiles that both France and England had in their arsenals. So there was a bit of a standoff at the time. A lot of people in the West at the time felt that the only way that we could move forward would be to make concessions. Whereas President Reagan, Thatcher, and many in the Western Alliance felt that we needed to negotiate through strength. And the only way we could negotiate through strength was if we had the will, demonstrated the will to deploy our own missiles. So anyway, at some point for this democracy course, I went out to one of these peace marches and picked up some literature, and it was a group that said, come to our meetings and we'll tell you more about what we do and why we feel that we shouldn't be deploying these missiles in the West, etc. So I thought that would be a great opportunity for it, in terms of participatory democracy. So I went there to quite a few meetings, and myself, a young activist, somewhat of the same inclination, that we ought to, wishing that we could get peace. And it's interesting, at the same time, there were a lot of people on the West saying, the Soviets aren't going to give anything that they can get us to give up for free. Um, Interesting point was that during these meetings, I noticed that after a while, one of the leaders of this meeting, he suggested that, in order to make their group more efficient in terms of their peace um, um, activities, they ought to have some kind of manifesto. And they started enunciating kind of socialist principles. And I remember that really struck me as odd. That was one of the few times I spoke up. And I might add that this group, they did view me a little bit suspiciously. Here's this American guy. The meetings were all in French because that was the language of Geneva. But who is this? There was this American guy coming to their meetings and whatnot. So they viewed me a little bit suspiciously, so I tended to be very quiet and mind my own business. But at hearing that the peace movement needed to adopt these socialist principles, I couldn't resist, and I spoke up. I said, well, why? What does peace have to do with socialism? Because although I was somewhat of the peace ideology, I also was an economist, and I don't see the link between the two in terms of one form of government necessarily, or one form of economy necessarily having to do with peace. They looked at me very strangely, like, of course, socialism, you got to be socialist. We're all socialist over here. Was kind of the attitude, although they didn't answer me directly. The reason I say that's interesting is later, after I had turned in my research paper, and by the way, I got a very good grade from the professor. He was kind of surprised that I had gone so far to look at these participatory democracy in such a way. But later I had heard it said in Western newspapers that the Soviets were busy trying to infiltrate all these peace marches and these peace groups. Their idea was if they could get us to not deploy our missiles or to not show resolve in deploying our missiles, if they could get us to give it up by infiltrating our groups, and they could put enough pressure on our governments to not go ahead with this, then why did they need to negotiate anything? They could have their missiles in Eastern Europe and we would just not have the resolve to counter that. The reason that ended up, and based on what I saw in my meetings, that may be very plausible. It may very well be that there were these influences, or it could just be the naivete or the class of thinking that was going on in that group. I'll never know. But it did make me realize by the end of the 80s, the West did show its resolve to go ahead with its deployment. And by the same token, on the Russian side, Gorbachev had come to power, had grown in stature and command. And eventually, as we know, Reagan was able to negotiate not only a peace treaty, but really the elimination of all intermediate range nuclear missiles, including those that were already deployed by the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe. So for me, that experience was interesting because I went in of that kind of youthful idea that we could get peace by just being more reasonable ourselves. And in fact, who we were negotiating was with people that did not allow their people freedom of speech. So the freedoms we enjoyed in Switzerland to have these marches, they did not enjoy in the West, in the Eastern Bloc. The freedom to move and travel, my ability to go to another country and study and to learn, they didn't have such freedoms. So we weren't necessarily negotiating with people with the same value system as we had. And that later, that negotiate through strength from Ronald Reagan seemed to be very important, and it contributed a lot to my going from a kind of a idealistic kind of bleeding liberal to a more pragmatic conservative later in life.
You mentioned that in the late 80s you were a businessman. Can you explain your role and your occupation?
Yeah, trained as an agricultural economist. The first job I had was, first significant job I had, was working for Chiquita Banana Company. I was first based for 3 years in New York City, and then they transferred me over to the European division.
So could you please elaborate on the experiences that you had in trading with Eastern Europe prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. You know, prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, there is actually a banana story that might be worth noting. But let me first preface that by stating that in Eastern Europe, the average person would find most supermarket shelves empty most of the time. There actually were long lines often, as even staple things like milk and bread and butter could be rationed. So people would actually queue up to find their goods. Now, there was some exception to that, or at least a modest exception to that. There was such a thing called Communist Party stores. You all should know that Communist Party officials were only 15% of the population. And to be a party official was quite an honor, and it had its privileges. And one of those privileges was special stores. It wasn't like in Western Europe where you had, you know, advertisements, come on in and, you know, buy our products. There would be a door, just a very nondescript door down an alley somewhere, and the Communist Party officials would know to go in that door, and inside would be their store where certain Western goods might be available. I say might be because even for Communist Party officials, bananas, for example, weren't available all the time. Now, our company, obviously being one of the largest or the largest banana company in the world, we did trade bananas with the Eastern Bloc countries. It was on special, suddenly a quota would arise and we would get a commission to quote a very large quantity of bananas. During the late 80s, an interesting situation occurred with Russia, where Russia was beginning to do some trade with Western European countries. And the communist governments, they loved something called barter, which is when you just trade one good for another good, and theoretically there's no exchange of money. And in this case, oddly enough, our company had bartered 4 Russian vessels for bananas. So in other words, we had 4 vessels in our 60-vessel fleet for Europe. 4 of those vessels were Russian owned and Russian crews operated. And they would go into the tropics according to our logistics requirements and pick up the bananas and bring them to Europe. And in exchange, particularly at the end of the year, we would deliver to them a certain quantity of bananas, which were used for you know, the special treat that the Communist Party officials would get at the end of the year, having bananas in their stores. Sounds like a crazy story, but that's actually some of how communism really worked at the time.
Are there any other memorable stories that could depict the situation in Eastern Europe?
Yeah, come to think of it, there is. I also was working on the importation of melons from the tropics during the winter months. Of course, Western Europe would get their melons in the summertime from their own countries, but in the winter they would normally be imported, and we used our banana vessels to bring these on deck of the banana vessel to transport them over to Europe. And in one particular case, I was transporting melons on one of these Russian vessels. And I have to say that these Russian crews were never allowed off the vessel for an entire 4-month period. Every 4 months, they would change crews in Gothenburg, Sweden, where a new crew would come on and the old crew would go off. It was actually kind of strange to see this, because the crew that was coming off the vessel would literally walk down the gangway and straight onto a bus, which would not stop until it got them back to Russia. So these people, although they worked for 4 months on a not say on a Western vessel because it was a Russian vessel, but they worked for 4 months transporting, going to all these countries. They never got off the boat during those 4 months. Now, there was an interesting story. I was in Gothenburg, Sweden, to check on one of my arrivals of the melons, which again were up on the deck of the banana vessel. Most of the bananas would be in the hold of the vessel, but I had these containers put on top of the vessel to bring my melons. And I was there inspecting to see how the arrival was. You know, sometimes the product is very perishable, you want to see how it is, and you have to do an inspection. So I had the container doors open and was, you know, doing my normal random selection of melons to see what condition they arrived in and all that. And then it was lunchtime, so we all, my colleagues and I, there were three of us, we just left the doors on the vessel open and we went off for lunch. Well, this occurred just at the time when one of these crew changes was about to happen after the 4-month journey. And when I got back from lunch, a whole bunch of boxes of melons were missing. And I thought that was strange, and I commented to my colleague from the banana division. I said that, you know, geez, we're missing like about 20 boxes of melons here. And before I even realized what was going on, my colleague, who had been done this many times with the bananas, was speaking with the captain, and he mentioned that melons were missing. Well, all of a sudden, the captain was very angry. He got off the vessel, went down the gangway, talked to the fellow in charge of bringing the crew of Russians back to Russia, and all of a sudden, literally, every single person in those 3 buses got off the bus with a melon in their hand and deposited them back in a pile to us. Of course, they'd already thrown the boxes overboard, so these melons were no good to us. But the thing that really struck me was how these fellows, after 4 months wanting to go home to their families with something special, some memorable thing from Western, you know, world, or, you know, they risked a lot just to bring a melon home. I don't know what happened to them afterwards. They were probably maybe punished, maybe they would get off if they had a decent overseer that was bringing them home. But it did say a lot to me. I felt terrible afterwards. I mean, I really had no idea what was to happen when I commented that we were missing about 20 boxes of melons. And had I understood things a little bit better, I mean, I would have been happy to, you know, to donate 20 boxes of melons to these guys to bring back with them. But it was a kind of a, you know, it seems like a small event, but somehow telling of what it must have been like to live behind the Iron Curtain.
Did you do business with Eastern Europe after the fall of the Iron Curtain?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I did, and there again, it was kind of historical luck on my part to be somewhere related to all of this. Just when I was about to go back to the U.S. after completing my 3-year mission with this division that I was to set up on non-banana fruits, the Iron Curtain had fallen, the Berlin Wall fell, and my company asked me to set up a new division to market bananas into the newly freed countries of Eastern Europe. So I was off to Vienna, Austria, and became responsible for the market development of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary.
The Iron Curtain speech was given by Winston Churchill on March 5, 1946, to emphasize the differences between the Soviet Union and Western nations. Churchill coined the term "Iron Curtain" to describe the line that was drawn between the East and West. This border was rarely crossed, but when it was, the differences were clear. After the curtain fell in 1991, which was also known as the fall of the Soviet Union, people from East and West were able to communicate freely, and the Eastern countries were finally gaining the freedoms that the West had had all along.
So what was it like selling bananas after the fall of the Iron Curtain and having people be able to buy them?
Well, actually, it's kind of an interesting question because if you go back to the magazines and the news reporting at the time of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, the fall of the Berlin Wall in Eastern Germany and whatnot. What you'll see is the first thing people did when they were rushed, when they had the chance to come into Western Europe, is they bought bananas as if they'd never get their hands on them again. And in fact, many Western news organizations featured this idea of people buying bananas it actually became symbolic of freedom, or at least the early freedom in Eastern Europe. Of course, people were yearning for much more than bananas, but because that was something so uniquely denied to them, something they knew about but rarely had the chance to have, that kind of became symbolic of those early days of the fall of the Iron Curtain.
Once you started working with Eastern Europe and trading with them, what did the different people in those countries tell you about living under a communist regime?
Well, quite a few interesting stories, but I'll save this to I'll spare you and save this to two quick stories. One, a very simple one. There was a girl working in our Czechoslovakian office who was commenting to me that she thought this newfound freedom was fantastic, and all of a sudden the stores had all kinds of clothing and there was all sorts of things that they could buy, all sorts of selection. And she came up to me one day, she said, but you know, I was at this boutique and this shirt, this blouse that I wanted to buy, it was costing $140. And she was just shocked. She says, I can't afford that. I mean, the salary's not big enough. And I remember thinking to myself, I said to her, well, you know, to be honest, I've never bought a $140 shirt in my life. One thing about the Western world is that we get the range of options, and if you can afford it, you buy the $140 shirt, but most of us have to settle for the $20 shirt. So there was a kind of naivete in Eastern Europe about what it really meant to have that freedom and that choice, and all of that availability doesn't necessarily mean you get to buy everything in the store. That's just a simple story. There was a more interesting and profound story that came from, in fact, this girl's manager, because the country manager that we hired, or I hired for Czechoslovakia, happened to be the former Deputy Minister of Industry. So he was a high-ranking Communist Party official in the Czechoslovakian government prior to the fall of communism. And you may think it's kind of strange that a guy goes from the world of communism as a Deputy Minister of Industry and becomes country manager for the sale of bananas. That's just another irony of the whole story. But interesting in chatting with him, having those moments over a beer or dinner, to chat with him, occasionally I would ask him, so what was it like growing up? What was it like in your household? I mean, how did you guys feel? How did you make the switch from communism to capitalism? He would say to me, well, first, to be frankly honest, most Czechoslovakians, even the Communist Party officials, they weren't ready for the switch. They really didn't want communism, and they didn't want to be dominated by the Soviet Union. But the fact is, if you lived in those countries, and remember, the Czechs tried to have their kind of revolution. They tried to break free of the Soviets in the 60s and were unsuccessful. They were put down brutally by the Soviet Union and their allies to put down that revolution, just as had happened with Hungary as well in the 50s. So they kind of had growing up in Czechoslovakia, if you aspired to be kind of middle class, what we would call middle class, what we might even call upper middle class, because we're talking about that upper 15% of their population, you had to be a Communist Party official. Those were the guys that might get some special privileges, might rise up through the bureaucracy, etc. So if you wanted to join, have a little bit better life for your kids, maybe a chance for your kids to go to school and be educated, you kind of had to toe the party line. I mean, that's where that expression comes from, toe the party line. And so these guys didn't necessarily all believe in all of this, but that's kind of what you had to do. And it's not like they had, as I said, that they hadn't tried to break free of it before. One of the things that Ladislav, that was my country manager's name, one of the things that Ladislav had mentioned to me that was particularly difficult was, he said, we would talk at home in almost a code, because we were always afraid that if our kids overheard us speaking about, this government official or this, the ridiculousness of their situation, or if they ever were heard saying the wrong thing and the kid went to school and repeated what the father had said or the mother had said, they could lose their job, they could lose their position, they could lose everything, they could even go to jail. So families, especially members of the political class, the bureaucratic class, they kind of had to talk in code at home, and they were very careful, and they were always a little bit afraid that somebody would say something that could get them into trouble. I think that sounds chilling. It is chilling. I was literally, I had always heard that, but I was really chilled to hear it from a first-hand source, a high government official who lived that. And so that also marked quite an impression on me in my later years.